it is a microservice with a brain. So it doesn't just talk using APIs, although it may. It talks natural language, for example.
All we were talking about was coding agents. And Eric and I started the podcast talking about enterprise agents. And I said, listen, Eric, we need to have a conversation about coding agents so that we can participate in the discourse.
Hey, welcome to another episode of the Confluent Developer Podcast. I am your host, Tim Berglund, and today I got to talk to Eric, Broda, and John Miller about the idea of an agent mesh, which is about what it sounds like. Now, who is John and who is Eric? John is the co-founder of a company called Enid Technologies. He's a AI systems builder and a data architect, goes way back in that space. Eric is a guy who comes from technology exec positions in finance, and he really likes meshes. He wrote a book on service mesh, data mesh, and now agent mesh. Meshes rule everything around Eric. And, you know, I actually really loved this conversation today. It was just super interesting. Eric and John talk about their notion of this web of enterprise agents collaborating and all of the typical enterprise concerns that need to be addressed in that, and kind of a framework for doing that. And they have a really provocative view, I thought provocative view, of how to build an agent. You know, you're wondering which framework is it? Is it Spring? Is it which? How are they doing it? Well, no, I'm not going to tell you in the intro. You're going to have to listen in the podcast. We spend, frankly, most of the episode talking about that, and only a little bit talking about the mesh. I hope I can have them back on the show again soon to get more. So great conversation. Let's dive in. Eric and John, welcome to the show. Glad to have both of you here.
Great to be here.
Yeah, it's great to see you from London. I'm joining you from the hot climates of Northern Europe, where it's become very hot in the springtime. So it's great to see you.
For the record, we're recording this May 27th, 2026. Check the weather. It's not a good afternoon to be in London.
No, it's not. I know. I'm seeing people in the city in shorts. It's very rare in the financial district. Yeah.
Not how it happens. So you guys together talk about this concept of the agentic mesh. You got a YouTube podcast. You got a podcast. You got a YouTube channel. You got a Substack. Eric, you're co-author of a book by that name. What is that, and why is it important? Here we are in the middle of 2026.
Yeah, sure. So I think everybody's heard of agents, but most people think of coding agents, Claude Code, Codex. These things are fantastic productivity tools. But what we believe is that you don't work with one agent in an enterprise or 10 of them. In fact, you're going to have thousands, maybe millions of them. If you believe Jensen Huang and the others, we're going to have a vast ecosystem of agents. And they're going to operate very differently. They're not going to be tied to an individual user or user interface. They will be participants in a business process. And that means that they're going to have a whole set of capabilities and constraints, if you will, that are different than what folks are used to dealing with today. So Agentic Mesh, the book and the concept, is really about organizing the ecosystem of agents. And what do you need to do to allow agents to safely, first off, find each other, and then safely collaborate, interact, and even transact? So this means this is all about enterprise-grade agents and the enterprise-grade agent ecosystem that they run in.
Let me ask a potentially spicy question right out of the gate there. It sounds like you just described microservices. And I like that account of agents, but why are those units of software you just described, why are they not the things we would have been talking about 5-6 years ago?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. So microservices are they're obviously headless, they're ambient, but I'll use some simplistic terms. They're not smart. So in our terminology, an agent is actually, if you deploy it as part of a business process, headless, if you will, it is a microservice with a brain. So it doesn't just talk using APIs, although it may. It talks natural language, for example, and it responds using the intelligence in the large language models behind it. So we actually think they're closely related, but again, to turn a really simple, pithy phrase, they're not just microservices; they're smart microservices, and that intelligence allows them to far exceed the capability of a microservice and allows them to actually, like I said, find each other and safely interact and collaborate in new and innovative ways. So they're related, but a little bit different.
Would it be fair to say that the smart is an LLM? There's a large language model that they're calling in there. Is that it?
Absolutely. I would extend that a little bit. So what we've done is we put LLMs, small language models, large language models, and everything in between in the microservices. But we also put Claude Code in a microservice, in a container. So we do that with Codex also. So what ends up happening now is where an LLM, we probably know the difference, but for the audience, I'll elaborate a bit. An LLM has, for lack of a better word, intelligence. The Claude Code or Codex have the harness that allows them to do very compelling, long-running work. So when we package these LLMs first in a microservice, you get some capability. But we actually found a way to very securely package Claude Code or Codex and some of the other innovative coding agents. And by the way, I call them coding agents. That's not meant to be pejorative. They can do much more than coding agents. But the key here is we actually package agents that can do not just simple tasks or respond to simple queries in a natural language, mind you, but they can actually do very sophisticated, long-running, complex tasks. So what we have now is not just a simple microservice or a smart microservice. We actually have a microservice that can do extended amounts of work, which is not something that you can get easily unless you actually combine the technologies as I mentioned.
Okay, that is fascinating. So I want to get into the mesh stuff, okay? Because that's
Sure.
sort of what your property is all about, and what your thinking together is all about. But you're saying some things that are just kind of getting my wheels turning here. So
Yeah. Well, yeah. And Tim, as you asked that question about, isn't this just microservices? I think I would love to unpack some of that, because at the foreword of the book and the way uh, the agentic mesh idea came to light was very much the next evolution of distributed computing, right? So it wasn't novel that microservices would be the foundation layer for distributed computing, but how do you incorporate LLMs and agents inside that? And so when you asked that question, I thought, I wonder if you were going to go a different direction in how you were thinking about distributed services and microservices. So I'm sort of throwing it back to you a little bit.
there's I've got, in terms of the mesh and the orchestration and everything, definitely places I want to go there.
Okay.
I want to get there though.
Okay, good.
And by the way, just my opinion on this is not really what this podcast is about, but I happen to love the definition of it's a microservice that calls an LLM,
Right.
And does something. I would like to add, it causes some side effect
Right.
in the world. It's not a chatbot.
Well, and I think that's important, because what I have found is Eric and I talk to each other and to other folks, the level of understanding around what is an LLM, the difference between a chatbot and an agent, is sort of one level of understanding. The understanding of how does an agent use memory and how we think about trust, every dimension of a typical system design must be thought of when you're building a whole fleet of agents. And so let's go back, let's jump around a little bit, but it's fine to have fun with this discussion, because I think as the more we talk about the concepts on our podcast, the more we realize that a lot of these common themes, like how do you identify an agent? does it have its own ID? A lot of these basic concepts of distributed computing keep coming back over and over again.
Uh-huh.
We've solved them, but now we're revisiting them with AI. So, we could talk all day about this, which might be fun, but I would love if there's a train of thought that you wanted to take us on. That's great too.
Now, a quick word from our sponsor. Confluent Developer, the podcast, is brought to you by Confluent Developer, the website, which has everything you need as a developer of data streaming systems. And it's completely free. We've got curriculum, hands-on exercises, executable tutorials, the online data streaming engineer certification, also free, a way to find a meetup near you, those are free. Everything is there. I really want you to be successful in your journey as a data streaming engineer, and this is the site that has what you need. Check it out at developer.confluent.io. That's developer.confluent.io. Now, back to the show. I think we need to get there.
Okay.
But, and by the way, everybody, don't miss that John said the podcast, the Agentic Mesh podcast, linked in the show notes. I think you're at this point morally obligated to check that out.
Thanks, Tim.
Yeah, no, definitely do that. This is because this is really important stuff. We're I think up-leveling the conversation, this sort of this kind of 60th percentile Twitter conversation about agents that, Eric, you hinted at this, is just about Claude Code or, no, Codex. And, okay, that's, we can have that. And they're great. I mean, I was working on a project this morning before work with Claude. Love that life. But, the agents that we write to power the business, I think, is the much more important thing. And Eric, you said something that's got my head spinning a little bit. Using Claude Code itself as the harness inside one of those, I'll just say for our purposes now, an enterprise agent, an agent in a business doing stuff. I have thought, and most of the conversation I've seen, and folks I've talked to, and looking at the frameworks and everything, it's all early days. So it's not like all the stories of all of the successful agent deployments are, you're scraping them out of your shoe and you're walking to the car in the morning. They're not exactly all over the place. We're talking about it more than we're doing it. But I have thought that harness, that agent loop, is a thing that really we write in the enterprise agent and not just bring in Claude Code. So before we get to the mesh stuff, could you expand on that?
Yeah,
sure. So
either one of you. These are all jump balls for my two guests. You guys.
Yeah, no, I love it, Tim.
Yeah. So here's the analogy that I think I would use, and it may stretch a little bit too far, so my apologies, but it is quite appropriate, at least for this part of the discussion. Every organization has employees. Some big organizations have thousands of employees. These employees do work. These employees are able to do the work because they have tools and they have the intelligence and smarts to fulfill a job description and complete tasks. Our proposition is if you have a sufficiently capable agent like Claude Code, the analogy is very appropriate. Claude Code or Codex, I'll use them in general, these coding agents have the capability to do remarkable amounts of work, not just coding, although that is the primary purpose that we see now. We can see Anthropic moving into financial, providing skills and capabilities around financial services and regulatory and compliance. They know the fact that Claude Code is not just a coding agent, and that's why they they have Claude Cowork also. Here's the fundamental thing is these agents are supremely capable and they can function with a little bit of help, I suppose, and they're not necessarily 100% at all replacements for people, maybe augmenting the capability, but they can participate in business processes. They have the intelligence and the smarts to participate in a business process. A simple LLM does not. You need to write the full harness, the looping, and all the rest of the stuff. But things like Claude Code, Anthropic, OpenAI with Codex have figured this out. We take advantage of that. Our mission is to actually enable these agents to, again, safely find each other, collaborate, interact, and transact. That's when the real value occurs. That means that we need to have agents that are smart enough, Claude Code, Codex, that can actually participate in a real, practical way as participants in the business process. How to do that? You need to wrap them in a container, deploy them as a microservice, for example, and you need to provide a very robust communications backbone. And like I said, we're pretty biased in this. We think event-based communications is the way to go. Things like Confluent Kafka, and there's a few others that are out there. This is the communication fabric for agents that enable them to collaborate at scale, allows us to take advantage of the intelligence that is only growing of things like Claude Code and Codex. That's what we think our perspective is a little bit different than that 60% traffic that you see on Twitter, perhaps. But we think this is where the future actually is, Tim.
Okay. It's sometimes as a podcast host, when you have your mind a little bit blown in the middle of an interview, you have to kind of like stop and say, I am rethinking some things now. But I like where you're going. I guess that means, I mean, you just said you take Claude Code and wrap it with communications harness. I would put Kafka endpoints, producer consumer sorts of things on there. And I want to ask you next is like, okay, tell me about this mesh now. What is it besides that? But then quote unquote, writing an agent would be reduced to skills, MCP connections if necessary. It's really, for that to be in any sense specialized to a business process would mean it has access to skills, but this agent of yours is a fairly generalized thing.
I'm going to say yes and no. So there's a bunch of things you have to actually wrap around this microservice containerized version of Claude Code in order to make it work in the enterprise. It needs to have an identity. It needs to have access controls. It needs to be discoverable, observable, operable. It needs to be explainable. We need to, every action and information that it processes needs to be audited. So there's a bunch of capability that actually needs to be wrapped around these that actually we believe are not necessarily just part of the agent, but they're part of the mesh. They're part of the fabric, not just the communication fabric, the identity fabric, the authorization fabric, the trust fabric that you need to actually implement. That's part of the mesh capability. And then the last thing I would say, so one last thing, John, the last thing I would say is that the mesh sounds like you got thousands of these things running around. The form factor that we see for the mesh is actually a business process. And that's why I come back to agents are participants in the business process. That's how they are arranged. Now, the task definition as part of a process, that's where you actually embody the skills and the tools, because we strongly believe that if you have these unbounded agents, they can access Bash, they can access the internet, which is what you can do today. That is not the model that any chief security officer is going to let you get away with. It'd be silly to actually put those things allowing that type of access. So what we believe is you need to have a very sophisticated framework around the task that the agent wants to do and the specific skills and the specific tools that need to be accessed at that point in time, for that point in time, just for the duration of the task. So there's actually a lot of capability. Once you believe you need these things participate in an enterprise business process, there's a whole ecosystem of capability you have to actually add. John, I know you've been itching to say stuff.
Well, I know, and this is what I love about our podcast is we send cues. Hey, Eric, I want to interrupt.
How to negotiate the mic,
yeah,
exactly. Very important.
But this is what I love about this thing is that we are also learning. 6 months ago it was context engineering. Then it became decision traces, and now we're talking about memory, and now we're talking about the combination of structured data management principles. I'm a board member of the Data Management Association in LA and in the Bay Area. And we talk a lot about data management, but we also know that there's a whole practice around knowledge management that comes from a library sciences background. And when you start to think about a business process or anything you're building in Claude Code, without memory, you're kind of just making it all up. You're kind of just saying, well, I think I need all these technical things to work, but you also need to know what's the problem you're trying to solve. And often in businesses, that's one of the hardest things to do. And if I were to step back, here's what I would say. I think we can all agree is that getting business requirements for complex domains is a non-trivial task. And so what we have found is that part of building systems of agents is figuring out how you're going to provide them with the knowledge required so that they can participate inside a business process, or they can build new modules of code. So I think a lot of people are finding that when they're doing long-running Claude code sessions, they need to prep the agent with a bunch of memory. Well, that same memory should define the key business memory that is important to the business process. So I'm a data guy from way back, so I always like to make sure that we have the knowledge and data background to complement what was a very distributed computing world. When we talk about microservices, everybody forgets that they don't have state. So there's no data. So it's like microservices, yes, and there's a whole body of knowledge around how systems use information and data to run processes and to make Claude Code much better, right? So I think a lot of people are finding that creating a second brain or creating some form of memory that they can feed to their agents is not optional. It's actually part and parcel of building enterprise grade.
Yeah,
we did a lot of writing and talking about this. We called it virtual memory management, or what is the minimum viable context for an agent to be able to answer a question. Well, the knowledge part of how agents reason becomes the first class concern, because forget about microservices. An LLM has a limited amount of memory or context it can hold at one time. It's like a human short-term memory. If you don't know about it and you can't recall, you can't make a decision. I'm on a soapbox. Let me pause for a second.
And like you said, context engineering as a leading edge topic is 12 months old. It's not the thing people are talking about. It's not a thing anymore because context is still a scarce resource in our LLM calls. So it's a thing we do, and I view memory as a part of that. So how does this work? So maybe from an infrastructure standpoint, and I'm always the one who wants to talk about implementation, which the mesh people tend not to like, but indulge me. What are the forms that you see memory taking in the mesh, and how do you wire that into Claude Code? Like, how do you is that now a skill? How do you motivate it to write?
Yeah. So Eric, you might want to go first. When we just recorded episode 19 a few months ago, and it was all about memory. So we've got a well-rehearsed speech.
You guys
how to think about memory. Yes.
Yeah, so we were pretty opinionated on this, but let me kind of set the stage. There's probably, and I think we talked about this at length in the discussion in the podcast, plus in the article. There's five. I think I'm going to say 5 different types of memory, and you need to think about all these. So I want to separate the types from how you actually store and make it available. But there's obviously static memory. This is what the LLM comes with, or the agent. So I'm going to use LLM and agent interchangeably for this point of the discussion. This is the pre-trained stuff. The second piece, though, is long-term enterprise memory. So if I have an enterprise agent and it wants to execute a compliance process, it behooves it to make that information about how the company or the enterprise wants to do that, how specific it may be. That is what we call enterprise memory. So that's the stuff that gets boiled down and put into the context. There's semantic.
Is that the implementation? I hesitate to use such a gauche term in 2026. Would that be RAG, Eric?
RAG would be a very simplistic view of that. We think there's a bunch more, without going into too much detail, knowledge graphs, ontologies,
Okay.
and these all are opportunities available, and we use some of them. But that's part of the semantic memory bucket. So concepts, definitions, and ontologies, policies on top of that need to be in there. Because all too often we store the concepts. What is an invoice? But there's processing instructions, tacit knowledge that needs to be captured around the policies and interpretation of what happens, for example, when the invoice amount is too high or there's an error in the invoice. So there's policies that also need to be captured. Um, there's shared memory amongst agents. So if you have agents doing work together and they're solving a bigger problem, they need to actually see each other's conversations. So that's part of that. And then we all need to boil this down into this token aware thing we call the minimum viable context. That assembles all of these things based off of an appropriate set of criteria, and it puts it into, and I think this is actually very, very crucial if you read some of the news on Twitter and such, in a token aware fashion. So that's why we emphasize it's not just the viable context, it's the minimum viable context that serves the right content at the right time in a token aware, token budget aware fashion. So that's the different types of memory. John is I would call an expert in a bunch of the implementation techniques. So John, I'll let you finish off this part of the discussion.
Well, Tim, did you have any questions about that? Because, a lot of people ask me, well, what is it? How do you implement that? And so, and
I mean, I'm thinking. I guess there are, skills that get triggered that call CLIs that call your semantic augmentation layer or
Yeah, we end up
MVP
calling
server.
it, we like anybody, we have a really cool acronym for. We call it the Agentic Knowledge Fabric, or AKF, but it's the
Okay.
thing that bundles all these
Okay.
capabilities together.
Nice. Okay. All right. So the agentic knowledge fabric.
yes, another three-letter
I think I
acronym.
can imagine that.
Yeah.
Just with the tools I said. Because again, and guys, your whole thing is the mesh, and I'm super obsessed with this. Wait, you're doing this with Claude Code? And so a lot of my questions are kind of around that and
Yeah.
how you connect it to the mesh. I will not. I won't apologize for that. I think it's an interesting.
No,
interesting part of
I think it's
John, keep
fundamental,
going.
Tim, to what
Yeah.
we're hearing. I was being based in San Francisco. All we were talking about was coding agents, and
Uh-huh.
Eric and I started the podcast talking about enterprise agents. And I said, listen, Eric, we need to have a conversation about coding agents so that we can participate in the discourse of our community, right? It's all about coding agents, but there's actually more to it than just that. So your perspective on thinking about coding agents as a first-class agent development platform, it's true. And
Yes.
it's a yes, and you need to think
We
about
can
some of these
just
Yeah.
other
So
concerns.
so
use them as their harness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting because I'll be honest with you, when we started our podcast and the Substack, and even the book, it was almost like we're shouting from the mountaintop and nobody's listening because we had such a radically different way of looking at this. The
Uh-huh.
reason I think is because John and I both come from, huge enterprise backgrounds. We solve big problems using things like microservices, event-based systems, so this is kind of natural for us to look at this as a form factor implementation approach. And it was a natural byproduct to figure out how we can make these microservices intelligent and how we could actually connect them using an event-based fabric. So to us, this was actually very natural. But only now are we starting to hear folks actually say, but we do still have to explain it. So we can say coding agents, love them, fantastic, remarkable things. We use them every single day. But here's a problem. First off, they're personal resources, individual resources, running under your own resource permissions, your own user ID, and it has access to that environment, whatever secrets you have in your
Which
environment
is a
variable, whatever. This is
fantastic way to
deadly.
live. You know,
So what we
Yeah.
do is we use the
YOLO.
capability, but we wrap them and allow them to communicate. Only now are we starting to get people to actually go, oh, you're right. There's a whole new opportunity here. So we're starting to get some traction, and people are starting to listen, which is fantastic.
now, sensitive to time. There's a couple more things
Sure.
I want to dig into here. And Eric, you rattled off a list of all the things that you need an agent to be able to do to be a participant in an enterprise system. It needs to be observable, authenticated, authorized. You listed some other things, and so solving those, I imagine, is a significant part of what the mesh really needs to do. Am I right there?
Absolutely. So we have been trying to put together all of these concepts into an open source capability. We'll be hopefully releasing that in the next, give or take, month or two. And the notion here is how do you get enterprise grade agents, an enterprise grade agent ecosystem using a form factor of process automation? We are implementing all of those capabilities. So we've wrapped in identity. And once you have an identity, you can attach roles and permissions. Once you have those, you can actually attach skills and tools. So all of a sudden, when you start to put all these pieces together, you can actually assemble ecosystems, not individual agents, but processes in gigantic ecosystems. So we're putting that together, and that should be ready in probably about 2 months' time, maybe a little bit less if we're fortunate. But it does all the things we mentioned, but it gives you explainability, it gives you observability, it gives you traceability, gives you audit logs. It gives you token accounting. You can actually see in real time the tokens that are being consumed by a task or a business process. So this is a capability that we think there's a huge opportunity for, and we think being able to give back a little bit to the community is probably the right way to bring it to market.
Of course. My guests today have been John Miller and Eric Broda. John and Eric, thank you so much for being a part of the Confluent Developer Podcast.